Welcome to the Natural Super Kids podcast, where you will discover practical strategies to inspire you to boost the health and nutrition of your kids. I'm Jessica Donovan, a qualified naturopath specialising in kids' health, and I want to make it as easy as possible for you to raise healthy and happy kids. Let's get into it. Hello. Welcome back to the Natural Super Kids podcast, everyone. So happy to have you here with us today. Today, I am joined by an amazing guest, Carolyn Ledowsky, and we are discussing MTHFR. Now, we have done a podcast episode not too long ago with another guest on MTHFR. That one is episode 105 with Joanne Kennedy, where we focused on MTHFR in relation to histamine intolerance and allergies and that sort of thing. And today we are talking about MTHFR again with the queen of MTHFR herself, Carolyn Ledowsky. But today we're talking about it more when it comes to anxiety, fertility, mood in kids, testing in kids. And so I think you'll really enjoy this episode. The last episode with Joanne was really popular, so we thought we would cover this topic again with a bit of a different angle. So, as I said, Carolyn Ledowsky is the queen of MTHFR in Australia. She's the founder of MTHFR Support Australia. I feel so privileged to have her on the podcast. Carolyn is a naturopath, a herbalist, a nutritionist who has a Bachelor of Herbal Medicine, Bachelor of Naturopathy, Diploma of Naturopathy and Diploma of Nutrition, and also has studied courses in genetics at the Duke University and the University of Maryland in the US. So Carolyn is a results-orientated health expert who has the ability to provide straightforward and practical advice to address your specific health issues, working with you through the entire course of your healing. And she has a team of other practitioners that works with her over at MTHFR Support Australia. She really does have an incredible knack of turning this complex topic of MTHFR into something that's really easy to understand. I really enjoyed this chat with Carolyn, and I know you will too. Hello, Carolyn. Welcome to the Natural Super Kids podcast.
It's good to be here.
So excited to talk to you and pick your brains about the complex topic of MTHFR. I think if anyone can simplify it for us, it is you. So can you just start by telling our listeners a little bit about your expertise in this area?
Yes, I set up MTHFR Support Australia almost nearly 13 years ago. I was very much a stickler for understanding blood work, and I found that half my patients had an elevated folate level, and I thought, that's weird. I wonder why some people have high, some people have low. So I contacted some of the labs and said, look, what's the significance of this? And they said, oh, that's really good. It means that they're having a lot of folate. And I thought, nah, I don't think it is that, because they're not having a lot of folate. So I then thought I need to find out why, and I Googled and I tried to find out why. No one could really help me. And I was at a conference in Melbourne or Adelaide, I can't remember now, it was so long ago. And one of these presenters just said, oh, yes, disturbed folate levels in the blood is due to MTHFR. And I thought, what? So I made a beeline for her at the end of the presentation and said, what is this MTHFR? And she said, oh, it's a gene that regulates folate. And I thought, oh, I have to find out about it. So that became my obsession. Mm-hmm. And I literally used to sit there till 4 o'clock in the morning, night after night after night, just reading, trying to understand. And then when I tested, and for those people that had high folate, I sort of experimented a bit, and I took them off folic acid, which I knew was synthetic, and I put them on the active folate we're meant to make. And all of a sudden, these levels started coming down, and they started to feel better, and they had less miscarriages, and their mood improved. And I thought, oh, oh, okay, we're onto something here. And so it has been 13 years of my life dedicated to not only MTHFR, but really understanding genetic susceptibility to the disease. You know, how do our genes actually impact our health? And how does our environment then kick off and make that susceptibility an actual thing? I'm now doing my Ph.D. with University of Technology, Sydney, in looking at different forms of folate with women that have recurrent miscarriage. So it's an ongoing thing. My mission in life is to make sure we get people to really, I really want us to stop using folic acid, and I want us to be using biologically active forms. And I think most people don't have an understanding that there's actually 3 forms of folate. One is folic acid. It's synthetic. We actually can't use it unless our bodies let us use it. And that relies on a variety of different genes, including MTHFR, but it's not ideal for those people, particularly that have MTHFR, because you can't convert it. That MTHFR enzyme is that last step in making you biologically active. Then you have folinic acid. That's active, but it is not the biologically active form. You still have to convert folinic to methylfolate, which is our biologically active form. And when I say biologically active form, what I mean is that's the form, methylfolate is the form that the brain uses, the placenta uses. You methylate your DNA to have good genes and good DNA for preconception and pregnancy. That is the form of folate that you need to reduce your anxiety, increase your mood, to think, to detox, to get rid of toxic estrogen, and make creatine, all these important processes that we need. That's the form of folate we need. So if you have an MTHFR gene, we call it a polymorphism now, not a mutation. What it essentially means is that gene that you have is different from what we expect. That's what a polymorphism means. It doesn't really mean a mutation. It just means it's different to what is expected in a DNA sequence. Now, sometimes that difference can be an upregulation, a downregulation, a deletion, an insertion, or sometimes it doesn't make any difference at all. But in the case of MTHFR, it means a downregulation. So if your mum and dad gave you a copy that is a polymorphism, you may have a down regulation up to 70%. If you have one copy of the C677T, it might be, 35 to 40%. So it really does matter. You can't, and I just don't understand how anybody that understands biochemistry can say it doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter, yeah. Because a decrease of 70% or a down regulation of 70%, that's going to affect our health in a lot of ways, right?
A lot of ways. And the thing about it is a lot of people will say, but look, I've obviously had this gene my whole life. I was born with it, but how come it's only affecting me now? And the reason is that our environment is a trigger. And probably the biggest trigger there is stress, because stress uses that methylfolate more than any other process. So let's say you were born with 2 copies that were polymorphic and you tootle along okay, but then you get to puberty, which is a physical stress.
Yeah.
Then you get to exams at the same time, which is an emotional stress and a physical stress. And let's say, a family member has a car accident and nearly dies. That's a huge emotional stress. And so we know that is a trigger for then that gene to say, well, I'm not happy. There's a problem here. And you fall into a bit of a biochemical hole in that your folate deficit that was just a little bit becomes bigger with every stressor that you have. And so you get to a stage where any stress is a trigger. And that's probably a really good sign and symptom for people to understand, is that if you don't cope with daily stress the way that other people do, and you think stress affects you more than it should, for me, that's a huge sign you could have MTHFR polymorphisms.
Yeah, that's really, you've explained that really well, because that's a question that I get asked a lot. Well, why now? Why have I not noticed it until now? And it's that, those environmental factors that sort of build up over time. So from a practical sense, can you tell us what that MTHFR polymorphism does to our health? How does that actually practically affect our health?
Yes, again, it depends on your environment. But if you were, say, because it affects our detoxification systems, if you were exposed to, say, estrogens in the environment, like plastic bottles and receipts, and you had a job where you were exposed to, say, paint fumes, or you live on a freeway where you're exposed to, petrol and the chemicals, then you would potentially, we see a lot of people with multiple chemical sensitivities, people that just can't detox because their detox pathways are jammed. They just have responses. Usually they get headaches all the time, or they might be very prone to migraines. We also find that because methylation, or these little methylfolate groups, are required for getting rid of toxic estrogen, we find a lot of people now, particularly because our environment is so estrogenic, that they're prone to estrogen type conditions like fibrocystic breasts, fibrocystic ovaries, endometriosis, fibroids, breast cancer, prostate cancer, weight gain around the middle, all of these things that we think will, and I think men are equally affected by that now. It's not just something that used to only affect women. It really does affect, And I think also brain, a lot of people come in and they will say, I think I'm getting Alzheimer's. But unfortunately, unfortunately, our brain works on fats. And we need things like creatine, we need phosphatidylcholine, we need phosphatidylserine, which are fats, to actually make our brain work. And that little methyl group that we get from methylfolate makes that happen. It converts those fats, so our brain. So I think Alzheimer's, or at least saying my brain is going, I can't think, I think is a big sign.
Foggy brain,
That foggy brain. I think anxiety and depression is huge because, again, it is that methylfolate that is absolutely critical for good brain function. So we see a lot of depression in the family. We usually see anxiety and depression in the family. We also see cardiovascular disease a lot in the family history because, again, this methylfolate is one of the critical ingredients we need to keep something called homocysteine under control. And homocysteine is a big cardiovascular risk factor. So you might have someone in the family where they've got high cholesterol. Fat metabolism is another issue. So we see cholesterol too high. We might see blood pressure too high. We might see history of stroke or a history of heart attack. And I think for me, the very big one is miscarriage and multiple miscarriage.
Yes.
Because why? Because folate is the number one thing that we need to prevent neural tube defects and miscarriages. And think about all the things that are neural tube defects. So they're basically midline disorders. So cleft lip, cleft palate are on the rise. All those people that have a hole in the heart, that's a midline disorder. So it is these spina bifida, all of these things that are in utero issues that are caused because of a lack of folate, I think are very much attributed to this whole folic acid versus methylfolate.
Yeah, and many women sort of find out that they have the MTHFR polymorphism when they have fertility issues, when they have pregnancy loss, multiple miscarriages. That's when potentially a health practitioner finally recommends the MTHFR sort of testing. And so it really does make sense, doesn't it? That importance of folate for all that development that's happening during pregnancy is one of the key things for that sort of healthy long-term pregnancy.
Yes, and look, the research now coming out says really if we need to be doing a 3-month preconception care, irrespective of anything else. And that 3-month preconception care actually affects not only your child's life, but their health for life, but also their child's child and their child's child's child. So 3 generations is impacted by what a woman does in the 3 months preconception.
Wow, that is just amazing. Like everyone should really let that sink in. It's not about just helping you get pregnant in the now. It's
Yes.
like that potential child's health for the rest of their life, and then their offspring, and then their offspring. Like, I mean, that's just so powerful, isn't it?
Absolutely, absolutely. It's scary when you think about it, that what you do. And that's why, we have a big proportion of our patients that come to us who have had multiple miscarriages. We're not talking about 1 or 2. We're talking about 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. We've had women that have had 10 failed IVF. And it's the same thing with IVF in my book. If you are not preparing your DNA, IVF's not going to be successful. That's why it's only got, at best, a 33% success rate, because you've got people that are trying to fall pregnant artificially, but they're not doing anything about the quality of the DNA or the folate. And what we find is we've got fertility specialists that refer patients back to our clinic, and very rarely do they ever go back to them because they fall pregnant naturally. But the ones that do go back for IVF, the success rate is so much greater.
Higher, yes. And that's such a good point. Like IVF shouldn't be seen as an alternative to, those natural fertility or nutritional things that we can do for our fertility. These things should be used as an adjunct, right?
Absolutely, because it's not helping you at all. And I think, if anything, it's making things worse because you haven't addressed the issue that you had the infertility with in the first place. And unless you do, if you've got, excuse the French, but crappy quality eggs and crappy quality sperm, it's not going to help you. Would you really want to artificially create a child with crappy sperm and crappy eggs? It's just, it just doesn't seem to make any sense. If you want to go through IVF, I have no problem with that. But what you've still got to do is your prep work for the 3 months and get your optimal level of B12 and folate and all those phosphatidylcholine, because that will improve the health of the child. It'll improve your success rate. So I actually don't think anyone should go into IVF without that prep work.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, here at Natural Super Kids, we see, we're seeing that huge increase in those childhood health conditions, the allergies, the eczema, the ADHD, the, kids on the spectrum, the digestive issues, the immune issues. And, I think obviously these are all multifactorial, but if we can do that preconception work, then we're going to see less of that naturally, aren't we?
Absolutely. And there was a great study that looked at the 5 milligram of folic acid that is often given to patients that are in fertility clinics when they find out they have MTHFR polymorphisms. And what they actually found is, if it was, for example, given to men, the quality of the sperm actually decreased, and the child was more likely to be born with ADD, ADHD, and neurological issues. So it isn't the best protocol, yet we know that if you get the folate right, you get the B12 right, and you get the phosphatidylcholine in. They've done clinical studies 5 years post-birth. Those kids that are well supported from a methylation perspective actually outdo neurological performance of the other kids by hundreds of percent. So it really does make a difference to optimize those nutrients. And I don't think it's something that you can compromise at all. It's all, and I totally get that, people who have had multiple miscarriages, all they want is a child now. Yes. And I really get that. But what I have to instill in them is that you have got 3 months, that's 12 weeks of your life, that will make a massive difference for the child's life. You cannot compromise, and I don't want you to. So you have to stick to this.
Yeah.
And if you tell them, they will actually see it and go, yeah, okay, all right, that's fine. I just want this one to be right.
Yes, and it's such an important message because, of course, there's that sort of, that desperation and that urgency, particularly because a lot of people are waiting until much later to even start trying for babies. So there's that biological clock ticking, but taking that 3 months is so important.
And I think, too, a really important message is that a lot of these IVF clinics are telling patients at the age of 29 and 30 that their eggs are getting old. And I would totally disagree with that at every level. I would say ignore that if you were told that. I don't think it makes any difference at all. We've still got women at 49 and 50 falling pregnant. And I don't think at 29 or 30 you are anywhere near being too old. And if that they're telling you that, then there's a problem with your nutrition and you need to do something about that, because that is not at all what a 29 or 30-year-old should be hearing. And I think it's completely unfair for women to be put under that pressure and forced into IVF because they're told they're too old at 29 and 30. It's just wrong.
That's really ridiculous, isn't it? Like you said, that's nowhere near the kind of age where eggs are generally, like the egg health is generally declining. And such a good point. Like, it's nutrition that has the best chance of changing that, the egg and sperm quality, isn't it?
Yes, 100%.
Yeah. Okay, so let's shift gears to children now. So when should we be thinking about testing for MTHFR in our kids?
It's a really good question, Jess. And I think it's probably the biggest question I get asked from my fertility patients that have had their bub. They know they've got MTHFR, and the very first, like literally the day out of hospital, when should I check? When should I check? When should I check? And I say, well, look, you've prepared well. You're going to be breastfeeding for the next, 6, 9, 12 months. You are continuing to take your prenatal multivitamins through breastfeeding. And that's a really important message. Keep taking it through breastfeeding. Do not stop when you've had the child, because the child has been used to your great nutrition, and that needs to continue through breast milk. What I then say to them is, as long as you are giving them good nutrition, you're giving them love and support, and they're sleeping okay, you don't need to test. What you need to test is when you start seeing the tantrums and the not coping with the stress and the sleep disturbances and anxiety increasing. That's when I would say, okay, let's test, and let's do some other biochemical organic acids testing, and let's see where they're at. Because if they are homozygous, for example, well, they might need a little bit of nutritional support to actually deal with, some of what is perceived just daily stress. Kids are busy. We want to keep them off those bloody devices as long as we possibly can. But I think, too, stress can creep in, particularly with these MTHFR polymorphisms. And we developed a range of drops for kids. And so it's good because you can titrate them up or down depending on what you think they might need. So a 2-year-old might only need a couple of drops. A 5-year-old might need 5 drops or 10 drops. But we think these little, methylated active Bs are really nice to just start introducing if you feel like they need it. So I would say the answer is, if there's no issues, you do not need to test, but make sure that the environment is good. And the environment is obviously the food they're eating, what they're drinking, the sleep they're getting, the toxins they're exposed to. I think one of the biggest issues we are going to have universally across the eastern seaboard in the next 5 to 10 years is this exposure to mold. And I would just say to every single parent out there, if your house has been exposed to mold, you absolutely need to check now. Everybody in the family is not exposed to mycotoxins, because that is the biggest emotional trigger and the biggest block in methylation that we are seeing right now. We have autistic kids that have improved by 95% by identifying these mycotoxins and dealing with them and getting the children unexposed to whatever it was in the house. So, and I think it's going to be dire because a lot of people have been affected by the water and the dam, and some houses have gone under. But you can't expect to go then and live in a house that's been completely water damaged without some sort of exposure. And unfortunately, well, I think fortunately now some of the insurance companies are recognizing that mold is a toxin. And I think you can really go in and fight battles to get repatriation of the house if there's been exposure to mold. So I think that's going to be a massive trigger for kids and indeed adults. And my building biologist that we use basically said to me, you've got two problems. We've had 3 years of moisture in the air, and if you have dust in your house, you have mold. So moisture plus dust equals mold. And so I would say every parent, be obsessive, be OCD about your dusting. Get a really nice microfiber cloth, put a couple of drops of essential oils, and just dust everything down, clean every cupboard, get rid of anything that doesn't need to be on top of a bench. Minimalistic dust, go through every room in the house, go through every cupboard. If you see any mold on any child's clothes, you need to immediately take action. Chuck it, don't keep it, and get a building biologist in to assess the house. And they can get in touch with our clinic if they want good contacts. We have a great contact list Australia-wide. They can just go onto our website, MTHFRsupport.com.au, and just call the clinic and say, look, we want a good building biologist in our area. Who would you recommend? And we've got contacts Australia-wide. We can send them. But do not ignore mold, and don't think that those moisture-containing things are great, because they might do a little bit, but if they're being filled up with water every day, you have a problem.
Yeah, that's such a good point. And, you know, really pressing at the moment, isn't it? The mold issue. I mean, we've had.
Oh, yes.
We've had a building biologist on the podcast before, but it's, I think, a topic that we need to cover more of because it is such a big issue. And as you're saying, like if you have the MTHFR polymorphism, then it's going to be that extra stress that your body doesn't need.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
So I think with kids, there's a lot of potential exposures that could trigger them.
Yes.
And I do think stress, and we're now learning a lot more about devices. And I think as parents, we have to be a lot stricter about our controls on devices. And one of my patients, I thought she had a really lovely idea. So what she did was, in the morning after breakfast, the kids got their mobile phones back. They went off to school. A lot of the schools are now putting restrictions in. You've got to lock them in your locker, which is great. The kids came home. They were allowed an hour on their device. They had to do their homework. Obviously, they're on their computer. And then they had an hour after dinner. Then she took all the phones, all the devices, put them downstairs for charging, and turned the Wi-Fi off. And everyone in the house slept, no device, no Wi-Fi, no nothing. And I think if you can get into patterns like that for kids when they're little, horrifyingly, you see prams now connected with iPad, connection points. And I'm thinking, what the hell? Like
toddlers can't even go out for dinner anymore without a device in front of them. So they're also missing so much more of that adult kind of interaction. There's so many negative flow-on effects from that. And, I definitely don't have it perfect. I've got a 15 and a 12-year-old, so it is a real challenge to keep them off of their devices.
It absolutely is. I just took my grandchildren away, my step-grandchildren, with my husband last week, and there's a 14-year-old, a 12-year-old, and an 8-year-old. And what was really nice is we obviously said to them, when we're out for dinner, no phones, put them away. They had periods of time through the day they could go on their device, but I made them sit and play games. So I taught them how to play card games. We played Guess Who and all sorts of different. And if they get engaged and they actually get, you spend some time with them, and it's hard because our lives are really busy. But I think it's really important that you've got to engage your kids with activities that the whole family actually, does together. And I think playing cards or playing games is a really nice thing to do. But I thought this parent I think she was really good. She was really strict, and she said, right, overnight charging, Wi-Fi goes off at 9.
Yeah.
Bad luck. We just turn it off. You don't have access to it. I'm taking the mobile phones. I'm locking them away. And they'll get charged overnight, and you'll get them after breakfast.
Yeah, because you can buy lock boxes that have chargers in them now.
Oh,
so that's
can
a really
you?
clever. Yeah, that's a really clever idea. And the other tip while I'm on this topic is I have an app called Family Link. So you have it on your device and the kid's device, and you can just shut it down, and their device just switches off.
Oh, wow.
And you can also put limits. So we recently have been on a 2.5-week trip around Tasmania, and I just said half an hour only on your phones while we're away. There was whinging, but it was like they got over it really quickly. They didn't need that constant kind of, connection to their friends. They had a little bit of time to write messages or do whatever they wanted to do. But yeah, I think it's really important that we have those boundaries around screen time for our kids.
Yep. And there was a research study actually, Jess, that came out this week, and it said they're now seeing that kids are getting social anxiety if they are not on their device. And I mean, that's a huge potential problem. Look, I was walking across the street at lunchtime. There were 6 people standing at the lights, and I was the only one not on my phone.
Not staring.
Like, it's like, seriously, guys, you need to, I mean, I get it. Like, yes, they want to be in contact all the time. But if my kids were young, I would actually take them to an island, and I would do a forcible detox of all devices for 2 to 3 weeks. And I would say, there is no Wi-Fi on the island. Sorry.
Yeah.
You can't have any. Because I think you need to physically detox them.
Yeah. And they don't know how to just have, I talk to my kids about this, like, if you're walking home from the bus stop with your phone in your hand, like, you just don't know ever how to have a blank brain or process, what's happened over the day, or.
I know. Yeah. Read a book.
Yeah.
I know. My mum used to force me to get into bed every night and read a book, and now it's an obsession. I don't go to bed without reading a book every night. Yeah. But they don't even know how to read books anymore, because their brain is so used to that, go, 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 go. It's just becoming completely ridiculous. But the research is saying that the exposure to this low-level Wi-Fi and these frequencies are actually changing the biochemistry of the brain.
Yeah.
Now, if you look then what's happening with the folic acid, and I'm working with researchers in Europe at looking at this, but the folic acid receptor that gets methylfolate into the brain, they're starting to think that is blocked by excessive folic acid.
Right.
Now, that could be part and parcel of why we're seeing an increase in anxiety, an increase in mood disorders, because these are, the kids that people are exposed to a lot more in the food particularly. And because it's a mandatory, you think about it, kids get up in the morning, they have breakfast cereal, they're exposed to folic acid. They take a sandwich to lunch, folic acid. They have some biscuits or a packet of something when they get home from school, folic acid. Like, they are exposed to it every second of every day in everything they eat. And it's not that these breakfast cereals have to be fortified. It's they can do it if they want or not. So they choose to because they think it's a great selling point. Fortified with folate.
Yes.
One looks at that and goes, oh, that's got to be a good thing.
Yeah. So can we just talk about some of those really common, like you've listed some there, like basically a lot of packet foods have added synthetic folic acid, which is not a good thing for our kids to be eating. So we want to be, really looking out for and making sure our kids aren't overdoing synthetic folic acid in things like breakfast cereals, breads, crackers. What else? Are they the main things?
So basically, anywhere that they use bread flour,
Yes,
has it. So, and it has to be a commercial product. Now, the rule is so diverse that if you're an organic product, you don't have to, but you can. So we actually have a list for our patients of all the products on the supermarket shelf that have folic acid versus don't. So, for example, Bill's bread is the only commercial bread flour that uses, you can buy it on the supermarket shelf, that does not have folic acid. I don't know how they get around it, because by law they're supposed to. So that's one, for example. So every bread roll, every bread, most breakfast cereals. So if you have say a muesli, organic muesli, unlikely. But if you see the word folate on a packet, it's folic acid.
It's usually right at the end of the ingredient list, right? Like it's pretty easy for folate or folic acid.
Yes, it'll say folate or folic acid, because we haven't worked out yet how to put the good folate in, because it's just so unstable. It's really hard. Whereas folic acid, because it's synthetic, it's very, very stable. So it stays in the bread. But if you pick up anything that is a packaged good, there's a 95% chance it's going to have folic acid in it. So it really means that you've got to be clever. So instead of giving them breakfast cereal, you might give them, a bread that's not fortified, or you might give them some bacon and eggs, or you might give them an omelette, or you might do some porridge. And then for lunches, look, my kids were at school, and for 12 years they did not take one sandwich.
Wow, you did well.
It was the best day of my life, the day they finished school, I'll tell you. It was like a lottery, and all their friends used to sit around and wait for them to expose the lid of the lunchbox so they could see what I had actually packed for them that day. But I had this funny little lunchbox which had about 6 categories, and then a little thing in the middle. So I used to always make them a little dip, avocado dip or something in the middle, and then they might have meatballs and carrot sticks, and so they had something different, or they'd have a fried rice with chicken and whatever. So I made a different thing every bloody day for 12 but I think it's a really good habit to get into, because you don't want your kids being exposed to folic acid.
No, constantly.
All day, every day.
Yeah, and I will just say, like, one of the tricks that I sort of do is I buy bread from the farmer's market. So it's just made by small producers, so they don't add folic acid or folate. So you can find ways around this. But when you're buying those mainstream brands from the supermarket, like you said, 95% chance that they will have this added folic acid. And so just circling back, can you just repeat why that's a problem, particularly when it comes to children's brain and mental health?
Yes. So the reason they originally fortified food is because in the US, there were population areas that had a high percentage of neural tube defects. And so they thought, well, if we put it in the food, we can minimize the risk. And look, at the end of the day, that's okay, because they couldn't afford supplements, they couldn't afford prenatal multivitamins, and it did work to some degree.
Yes.
But now that we have fortification across the board, I just published a paper in Nutrients Journal at the end of last year, which looked at the intake of folic acid or folate that women in preconception and pregnancy were getting, particularly if they took a folic acid-based prenatal multivitamin. And every single woman that took a prenatal multivitamin through pregnancy were exceeding the upper limit set by the Institute of Medicine. as
Yeah,
safe.
that doesn't surprise me. Yeah. And so we're talking about those, again, mainstream prenatals like Elevate
Yes.
that have the synthetic folic acid in them.
Yes. So it is a concern that we're exceeding these levels. And I think, so what the research tells us is this: folic acid is metabolized through an enzyme called DHFR, dihydrofolate reductase. Now, the research says that 200 to 300 micrograms a day is all that enzyme will cope with. So let's say a child is eating natural folate, but they're also having breakfast cereal, sandwiches and everything else. And let's say they're getting above 300. Well, most women, we know, if they're taking Elevate, they do get 800 in Elevate. So let's say they're taking that every day. And what happens to the amount of folic acid that doesn't get processed? It accumulates in the blood, and it's called unmetabolized folic acid. Now, this unmetabolized folic acid in the research, and it's not definitive by any means, but there are suggestions that it may be contributing to autism. There's suggestions that it may be contributing to cancer. There's suggestions that it may be contributing to diabetes and autoimmune disease. So we don't have anything definitive. But even if there's a suggestion, at this point, what I know about folate, that's enough. So the other suggestion in the research is that this unmetabolized folic acid acts almost like an MTHFR deficiency. So even if you don't have MTHFR polymorphisms, it's almost like you do, and it down-regulates the enzyme that then is meant to make active folate. So what's happening, they believe, is that the folic acid is actually stopping the good folate getting to the brain. It's stopping the good folate that we need for these metabolic processes. And if that's happening, then it's contributing to anxiety, depression, autism, all these things that we know, these neurological problems. That's the supposition. We don't have research yet. We don't have enough. But there is enough from a clinical perspective. And I can tell you, after 13 years, if we take people off folic acid completely, diet and supplements, and we look at their genetics and we substitute methylfolate accordingly, they improve. Their stress levels improve, their immune function improves, their brain function. Obviously, we look at a lot of other genetics in terms of, how do they make serotonin? How do they make dopamine? How do they make some of these other brain chemicals? How do they detox? So we're working on sort of a whole biochemical system to understand what actions we need to take. But one of the key ones is get the folic acid out.
Yeah.
And interestingly, some people just go, wow, just that one thing has changed a lot for me.
Yeah. And it's a simple enough thing to do. Like there's enough good quality supplements that have the methylfolate, the active form of folate that is actually beneficial for all of these processes and the brain and all the things that we're talking about. So it's not, too much of a challenge to do this.
No, and we used to have our prenatal multivitamin used to be only for practitioners to prescribe. And 2 years ago, I was doing a whole assessment of, well, what does the general public actually have access to on the supermarket shelf or on the pharmacy shelf? And I was really alarmed. There was not one prenatal on the shelf available to consumers without folic acid. Not one. And I thought, oh my God, that is bad. So I decided, no, I'm just going to make mine a retail product because there's enough. If practitioners want to prescribe ours, well, that's great. But I think consumers need access to a prenatal multivitamin that does not have folic acid. Why should they have to get it from overseas? We should be able to provide one here in Australia.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. And especially, like bringing light to everything that you've talked about today. If anyone is on a prenatal, through that preconception period, or pregnant now, or in that postnatal period and still taking their pregnancy prenatal vitamin, check and make sure, because there's no downsides to taking methylfolate, even if you don't have an MTHFR polymorphism, right?
Yeah, I would say unless there is an environmental exposure that's causing a block. So
Yeah.
things like mold and things like low B12
Yeah.
and things like yeast exposure can actually stop you uptaking that folate and might give you a headache. A lot of people, when it was first launched into the practitioner market years ago, they started to get headaches and people started to feel not so good. And so they stopped using it and they moved to folinic. And I said, hey, guys, no, that's not the answer. That's not how we address this. What we've got to do is say, okay, we know this is a block. This is a potential problem. We've got to unblock the block. Then we go back to using the folate. So that's another really important message, with methylfolate is it actually is really powerful. And if you take something with methylfolate and you have a bad reaction, just get in touch with our clinic straight away, because you really need to be able to go, okay, what does that mean? That means I have a block. And what we've got to do is find out where that block is, because you shouldn't have a reaction.
Yeah, that's such a good point. And I've heard that feedback from lots of people who have switched to something that contains methylfolate. Well, I could sit here and talk to you all day, but we better finish up. So can you, thank you so much for sharing all of your amazing wisdom. Can you let our listeners know where they can find out more about you and all the amazing resources that you have available?
Yes, we have a site, MTHFRsupport.com.au. We've got Facebook pages and everything else, but we have tens of thousands of hours of videos and information and support. And we also have a patient knowledge centre, which is really cheap to join, so you can be kept up to date with all the information, access our resources and everything else. So go and have a look on the website. We actually get a lot of practitioners that say, oh my God, there's so much information on that site. But just hone in on what you want to know. There's a section about what is MTHFR. I've recorded a video. So if you just want to know some basic information, there's a great video. There's lots of things that they can sort of tap into, and just contact us if you think, well, this makes a lot of sense. I think I probably need to find out a bit more.
Yeah, and I would just highly recommend, because there's so much information online about MTHFR, but I think your website is a really good go-to resource where there's trusted information. So if you're looking for more information and want to read up more about, anything that we've talked about today and anything to do with MTHFR, definitely check out the website. And I'll make sure the link is in the show notes for anyone who's listening. Thank you so much for joining us today, Carolyn.
You're welcome. We'll have to have another one on a different topic.
Yes, I'd love to have you back. We will organise that.
I'd love to do that, because it's great talking about this so people get a bit more of an idea, because I think you're right. There's a lot of misinformation and there's a lot of practitioners, I think particularly, overseas and even medical professionals that really don't know what this means. They don't understand the nuances of it. And it may not be simple, but it is really important to understand. And if any practitioner says to you it doesn't matter, just think about seeing them again, because I think it does. I really think it does matter. We have 9 practitioners in our clinic and they are fully booked all day, every day. So you can't tell me it doesn't matter. This really resonates with a lot of people. And when they find out the potential implications, they go, do you know what? That makes so much sense, because I can see it in my mother. I can see it in my father and my grandparents. I can see that we've potentially got this issue. And I think as our environment is becoming more toxic and more difficult for us to navigate, and we are in a more stressful environment, I think we're seeing more expression of it.
Yes. It's that old, the saying that says your genes are the loaded gun and it's the environment that sort of pulls the trigger, right?
100%, yes. And that's why it can just happen at any point. And it just really depends on that stress load and where you are. But a lot of people, we see patients that have had depression, for 50 years. And we look at their genetics and go, hey, we can see this isn't a serotonin issue. This is why those SSRIs and those antidepressants never worked. We need to look at your dopamine side. And, the results you get can be just phenomenal. And that's why I get so excited about this, because it's really individualized medicine, isn't it, Jess? It's looking at what is your DNA telling us that we've got to do? You're susceptible in certain areas, so what do? We plug up that susceptibility, and then I'm a firm believer that you go forward and you cope like everybody else.
Yeah. And it just hopefully, is giving lots of people that are listening hope that might have been through years and years of a particular health condition, whether it's depression, and nothing sort of ever worked. Like, this is definitely worth looking into. So thank you so much for joining me. And I hope you have a good rest of your day.
Thanks, Jess.
Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today. Head on over to our website, naturalsuperkids.com, for the show notes for this episode, as well as a whole heap of inspiration to help you raise healthy and happy kids. I'll see you next week.